What was it like to be a woman in the year 1165, nearly 900 years ago? How did a world without smartphones, without modern medicine, without even the idea of women's rights as we understand them today, truly function? What forms of suffering were common, so common they were often invisible, woven into the very fabric of daily life? Number 6, emotional and psychological manipulation. Imagine living in a world where your thoughts, your feelings, your very sense of self were constantly under attack, yet no one around you would even recognize it as abuse. In the year 1165, the concept of emotional abuse as a distinct form of harm simply did not exist in the way we understand it today. Yet the behaviors that constitute such abuse were deeply ingrained in the patriarchal societies of the High Middle Ages, often normalized and even encouraged by prevailing social norms, religious teachings, and legal structures that placed women in a subordinate position to men. Women were expected to be obedient, silent, humble, and submissive, especially to their husbands, fathers, and male guardians. Any deviation from these expectations could be met with severe psychological repercussions, often disguised as guidance, discipline, or even love. Consider the young wife, perhaps newly married at the tender age of 14, far from her childhood home and family. She arrives at her husband's manor or humble cottage, a stranger in a new place. Her husband, perhaps much older, holds absolute authority over her, sanctioned by both secular law and church doctrine. He might constantly belittle her intelligence, questioning her ability to manage the household or raise children. If she expresses an opinion that differs from his, he might dismiss it with a sneering laugh, or tell her she is too simple to understand matters of importance. He might openly compare her unfavorably to other women, perhaps his mother or a previous wife, subtly eroding her confidence and making her feel perpetually inadequate. This constant chipping away at her self-worth, delivered through sneers, sarcastic remarks, and dismissive gestures, would be a relentless and insidious form of abuse. She might internalize these criticisms, believing herself to be genuinely foolish or incapable, further cementing her subservience. Then there was the weapon of isolation. A husband, jealous or controlling, might restrict his wife's interactions with others. He might forbid her from visiting her family, even if they lived a day's journey away, or from attending local gatherings, such as market days or church festivities, without his explicit permission and supervision. He might intercept messages, spreading rumors about her to neighbors or servants to ensure no one would believe her if she dared to speak of her plight. This isolation would cut her off from potential allies, leaving her feeling utterly alone and without recourse. A noblewoman might find herself confined within the walls of her castle, her movements entirely dictated by her husband, her only companions being his chosen servants or attendants who might well be encouraged to report her every word and deed. Peasant woman, though perhaps having more physical freedom to work in the fields, might still be socially isolated within her small village, her reputation smeared by a controlling husband or a vindictive in-law, leading to a chilling silence from her neighbors who feared incurring the wrath of the man who held power over her. Furthermore, women were often subjected to a form of control that could be described as gaslighting, even though the term itself is modern. This involved undermining a woman's perception of reality. If a wife expressed distress over an incident, her husband might deny it ever happened, or claim she was imagining things, too sensitive or overly emotional. He might twist her words, making her doubt her own memory or sanity. For instance, if he took her dowry property and sold it, then claimed she had freely given it to him, and presented a false narrative to her family, she would be left questioning her own understanding of the events. This constant questioning of her perception would lead to profound confusion and a deep sense of powerlessness, as she would lose trust in her own mind and judgment, making her even more reliant on her abuser. The emotional toll of such manipulation was devastating. It fostered chronic anxiety, fear, and a pervasive sense of helplessness. A woman might develop deep depression, manifesting in listlessness, loss of appetite, or a general despair. Constant pressure to conform, to be silent, to suppress her own desires and opinions would lead to a profound loss of personal identity. She might become timid, withdrawn, and perpetually anxious, fearing the next cutting remark or the next act of control. The very spirit of a woman could be broken, leaving her a shell of her former self, existing solely to serve the needs and whims of her male controller. Historical accounts, though rarely detailing the inner lives of women in terms of psychological distress, offer glimpses into this reality through prescriptive texts and legal codes. Church sermons frequently emphasize the duty of wives to obey their husbands, equating disobedience with sin. Medieval medical texts sometimes attributed women's melancholy or hysteria to their inherent nature or reproductive organs, rather than to the stressful and oppressive conditions of their lives. These cultural narratives reinforced the idea that women's emotional struggles were inherent flaws, rather than consequences of their environment, further isolating them in their suffering. For a woman in 1165, there was no concept of therapy, no support groups, and very little understanding that her unseen wounds were valid. Her emotional anguish was her private burden, often endured in silence, deepening the suffering inflicted by constant psychological warfare. It was a pervasive, unspoken torment that permeated the daily lives of countless women, a silent violence that left no visible scars but devoured the soul. Number 5. Sexual coercion and lack of bodily autonomy. In the year 1165, a woman's body was rarely considered her own. This lack of bodily autonomy was a fundamental aspect of medieval society, deeply rooted in legal statutes, religious doctrines, and social customs that positioned women as property, either of their fathers, husbands, or lords. Consent, as a concept related to sexual acts, particularly within marriage, was virtually non-existent. Countless women, this meant an inescapable vulnerability to sexual coercion and violence, a reality that permeated every stratum of society, from the lowest peasant to the highest noblewoman. Within marriage, the wife was legally and religiously bound to submit to her husband's sexual demands. Church teachings, while advocating for procreation within marriage, also implicitly supported the husband's marital right to sexual access. If a wife refused her husband, it could be considered a breach of her marital duties and, in some interpretations, even a sin. There was no legal recourse for a woman who was forced into sexual relations by her husband. Marital rape was not only unrecognized as a crime, but was seen as a husband simply exercising his rightful authority. Imagine a young bride, perhaps barely past puberty, entering a marriage with a man she barely knows and being expected to fulfill all his physical desires without question or protest. Fear, her discomfort, her pain, would be entirely irrelevant in the eyes of the law, the church, and society. She would be expected to endure, to submit, and to bear children, often repeatedly, throughout her fertile years, regardless of her own health or desire. This constant expectation of availability, coupled with the absolute power imbalance, created a fertile ground for coercion, making every intimate encounter a potential site of unconsented subjugation. Beyond the marital bed, women were also profoundly vulnerable to sexual violence from men in positions of power. The feudal lord held significant authority over the women living on his lands. Droit du seigneur, or lord's right, while perhaps not uniformly codified as a first-night right, certainly represented the broader reality that lords could and often did demand sexual favors from their female tenants and servants with impunity. A peasant woman working in the fields or serving in the manor house would have virtually no protection against a lord's unwanted advances. To refuse could mean eviction, destitution for her family, or even physical harm. There was no court or authority she could appeal to that would reliably protect her, as the lord was often the ultimate arbiter of justice in his domain. The plea would likely fall on deaf ears, or worse, lead to further victimization as she would be seen as disobedient or rebellious. Travelers, soldiers, and even neighbors could also pose significant threats. Chaos of warfare or the simple anonymity of a journey made women, especially those traveling alone or in small groups, particularly susceptible to assault. While rape outside of marriage was theoretically a crime in some medieval legal systems, the burden of proof was extraordinarily high, and the woman's reputation and previous conduct were often put on trial. A victim might be subjected to invasive public questioning, accusations of promiscuity, or claims that she had somehow enticed her attacker. If she was a peasant and her attacker was a nobleman, the chances of justice were almost non-existent. Testimony of a woman, especially one of lower status, often carried less weight than that of a man, and the concept of honor was frequently more concerned with the male family's shame than with the woman's suffering. Physical and emotional consequences of such sexual coercion were catastrophic. Physically, women endured forced pregnancies, the dangers of childbirth in an era of primitive medicine, and the risk of contracting sexually transmitted diseases. Constant fear of assault, both within and outside the home, would have been a pervasive undercurrent of daily life, shaping their movements, their interactions, and their sense of safety. Emotionally, the experience of sexual violence, often repeated and normalized, led to deep trauma, shame, and a profound sense of defilement. Women might internalize the blame, believing themselves to be somehow responsible for their own victimization due to societal narratives that often cast women as temptresses. Medieval chronicles and court records, though sparse on the direct voices of female victims, obliquely reveal the prevalence of such assaults. Reports of violence against women, often in the context of disputes over property or accusations of adultery, hint at a pervasive climate where women's bodies were objects of male control and desire, rather than autonomous entities deserving of respect and protection. The very idea of a woman having ultimate control over her own body was a concept far removed from the realities of 1165. Her existence, her purpose, and her physical self were inextricably linked to the needs and rights of the men who governed her life, leaving her continuously vulnerable to physical and sexual domination with little hope of escape or justice. It was a world where a woman's honor was often equated with her sexual purity, yet that purity was perpetually at risk from the very men who were meant to protect it, highlighting a cruel irony that underscored the pervasive lack of bodily autonomy. Number 4, social shaming and ostracization. In the tightly knit, often insular communities of 1165, a woman's social standing and reputation were paramount, often determining her very survival and the well-being of her family. Unlike physical blows that left bruises or economic deprivation that led to hunger, social shaming and ostracization inflicted wounds that were unseen, but could be equally devastating, stripping a woman of her dignity, her community support, and sometimes even her home. This form of abuse operated through the weaponization of gossip, slander, public humiliation, and the rigid enforcement of moral codes that disproportionately targeted women. The most potent form of social shaming revolved around a woman's perceived sexual purity and obedience. Unmarried women, the loss of virginity outside of wedlock could bring immense shame upon her and her family, drastically reducing her prospects for a good marriage, or indeed, any marriage at all. If she became pregnant, the social consequences were often catastrophic, leading to public condemnation, banishment from her family home, and destitution for both her and her child. Imagine a young woman in a small village, discovered to be pregnant out of wedlock. The whispers would begin immediately, spreading like wildfire through the community. She might be openly scorned by her neighbors, excluded from village gatherings, and denied charity or assistance. Family, shamed by her perceived transgression, might disown her, leaving her utterly alone to face a hostile world with no means of support. This public humiliation, often orchestrated by community leaders or even her own family members, served as a stark warning to others to adhere to the strict moral code. Married women faced equally severe social judgment for perceived infidelity or disobedience. While men's infidelities were often overlooked or quietly accepted, a wife's alleged adultery could lead to immediate social ruin. She might be publicly accused, her name dragged through the mud, and her reputation irrevocably destroyed. In some regions, legal or customary practices allowed for public shaming rituals, such as being paraded through the streets or having her hair shorn, a deeply humiliating act in a society where a woman's hair was a symbol of her beauty and modesty. Such public spectacles were designed not only to punish the individual woman, but to reinforce societal norms and control female behavior. The loss of honor for a wife through perceived sexual misconduct could also have dire economic consequences, as her husband might divorce her, take back her dowry, and leave her with nothing, further compounding her social isolation. Beyond sexual conduct, any behavior deemed unwomanly or disobedient could also lead to social censure. A woman who was too outspoken, too independent, or who challenged male authority, even within her own household, risked being labeled as a shrew, a scold, or even accused of more serious offenses. These labels could be spread through gossip, undermining her standing within the community. A woman who repeatedly argued with her husband, even if she was defending herself from abuse, might be seen as failing in her wifely duties. She could be publicly ridiculed, perhaps even subjected to rough music, a form of public protest involving cacophonous noise meant to shame and punish individuals who violated social norms. Such acts of collective disapproval ensured that women conformed to the rigid expectations of humility, subservience, and quiet industriousness. Church also played a significant role in enforcing social norms through moral teachings and the threat of excommunication. Women who transgressed moral boundaries, as defined by religious authorities, could face public penance, exclusion from sacraments, and the condemnation of their souls, adding a spiritual layer to their social ostracization. Fear of damnation, coupled with earthly disgrace, was a powerful tool for social control. Consequences of social shaming and ostracization were far-reaching. A woman stripped of her reputation could lose her network of support, her friends, her family, her neighbors. She might be denied access to communal resources, such as shared ovens or wells, or simply be ignored and excluded from social interaction. For a woman, particularly one with no independent means, this social death could be a precursor to physical destitution. She might be forced to leave her home, wandering as an outcast, or resort to begging to survive. The emotional toll was immense, leading to profound loneliness, despair, and a sense of utter worthlessness. No one to turn to, and no voice to defend herself against the tide of public opinion, a woman subjected to social shaming in 1165 was condemned to a life of isolation, her very existence rendered invisible and without value in the eyes of the community. It was a silent, insidious form of violence that could be as destructive as any physical blow, leaving indelible scars on the soul and tearing apart the fragile threads of a woman's connection to the world. Number 3. Economic exploitation and deprivation. In the year 1165, a woman's economic standing was almost entirely determined by her relationship to a man, her father, her husband, her brother, or her lord. With very few exceptions, women could not own property independently, engage in legal contracts without male guardianship, or pursue occupations that would grant them financial autonomy. This fundamental lack of economic rights made them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation and deliberate deprivation, forms of abuse that could leave them utterly destitute and without recourse. One of the most significant areas of economic vulnerability was the dowry. Dowry was the property or wealth that a bride brought to her husband at marriage, often consisting of land, money, goods, or livestock. While ostensibly meant to support the wife and her children, and to provide her with some security in widowhood, the dowry was legally controlled by the husband. He could manage it, invest it, or even squander it. Imagine a situation where a woman's family had painstakingly saved for years to provide her with a substantial dowry, hoping it would ensure her a secure future. Her husband, perhaps a gambler or a drunkard, might systematically misuse or sell off her dowry assets, leaving her with nothing. If he died, she might find herself with no remaining resources, and if she were to divorce him, which was exceedingly rare and difficult, she would have little hope of reclaiming her original assets. The promise of security that the dowry represented often dissolved into a vehicle for a husband's exploitation. Widows, though potentially having more legal rights than married women, were still highly vulnerable. While some medieval legal systems recognized a widow's right to dower, typically a third of her deceased husband's land or property for her lifetime, this right was frequently challenged by male relatives. A woman who had just lost her husband, perhaps the primary protector and provider, might find herself battling her husband's brothers or other male kin who sought to seize the entire inheritance, leaving her and her children impoverished. She might be forced into a new marriage against her will to secure her dower rights, or face the daunting prospect of managing her land and resources without the practical support and legal standing of a man, making her an easy target for unscrupulous neighbors or lords. Many widows, particularly those without children or powerful family connections, found themselves swiftly dispossessed and reduced to beggary. For women of lower social status, the economic exploitation was even more direct. Peasant women worked tirelessly in the fields, alongside their husbands or fathers, contributing vital labor to the household economy. They churned butter, spun wool, wove cloth, tended gardens, and cared for livestock, yet they rarely had control over the fruits of their labor. Produce, the income, and the decisions about resources were typically managed by the male head of the household. Father might refuse to provide his daughter with a proper dowry, leaving her with no means to secure a desirable marriage, or exploit her labor for his own benefit without offering her any share of the proceeds. A husband might withhold food, clothing, or shelter from his wife and children as a means of control, a form of deliberate deprivation that could lead to chronic illness and starvation. This was not merely neglect, but a calculated act of power designed to keep a woman utterly dependent and subservient. Female servants, who made up a significant portion of the working female population, were also highly susceptible to economic abuse. They were often paid meager wages, if at all, sometimes only receiving board and lodging for their strenuous labor. Their masters or mistresses might refuse to pay them what was due, or dismiss them without cause, leaving them vulnerable to destitution. Limited avenues for formal complaint and little legal standing, a servant woman had few means to seek justice for withheld wages or unfair dismissal. Economic existence was precarious, always at the mercy of those who employed her. The long-term impact of economic exploitation and deprivation was profound. Trapped women in cycles of poverty and dependence, preventing them from ever achieving true autonomy or security. Limited their choices in marriage, often forcing them into undesirable unions for the sake of survival. It meant that a woman's health, her children's well-being, and her very ability to sustain life were constantly at risk, subject to the whims and control of men. Without economic independence, women were fundamentally disempowered, unable to escape abusive situations, challenge unfair treatment, or build a secure future for themselves. Historical records, such as manorial court rolls and legal documents, often hint at these struggles, showing women appealing for portions of their dower or struggling to hold onto land, painting a picture of a world where a woman's economic fate was rarely her own, and often brutally exploited by those who held the reins of power and wealth. Number 2. Forced marriage and betrothal. In the year 1165, marriage was rarely a matter of love or personal choice for women. It was a strategic alliance, a transfer of property, and a means of securing lineage, wealth, or political power. Countless women, this meant being compelled into marriages or betrothals against their will, often at a very young age, a profound form of abuse that stripped them of their autonomy, their childhood, and their fundamental right to determine their own future. From the highest nobility to the humblest peasantry, the decision of who a woman would marry typically rested with her father, or in his absence, her male guardian, a brother, an uncle, or even a feudal lord. Daughters were seen as valuable assets, to be bartered and exchanged for advantage. A noble family might arrange a marriage for their daughter at the tender age of 10 or 12, often with a much older man, solely to secure a peace treaty, gain land, or consolidate political influence. These betrothals were legally binding, and the young girl had no say in the matter. She might be sent away from her home and family, sometimes to a foreign land, to live with her future husband's family, effectively growing up under the tutelage of strangers, knowing her fate was sealed. The emotional trauma of such a separation, compounded by the terrifying prospect of a forced union with a stranger, often an adult man, cannot be overstated. Peasant women, while the scale of alliances was smaller, the principle was much the same. Father might arrange his daughter's marriage to a man from a neighboring village or a man who owned more land, hoping to improve the family's economic standing or to gain more working hands for the farm. Daughter, though she might have more opportunity to meet her future husband before the wedding than a noblewoman, still had little power to refuse the match her father had chosen. Disobedience could mean severe punishment, disinheritance, or being cast out of the home, leaving her with no means of support in a society where an unmarried woman had virtually no place. Child marriage was a particularly egregious aspect of forced marriage. While canon law stated that girls could marry from the age of 12 and boys from 14, betrothals often occurred much earlier, sometimes even in infancy. These early agreements were designed to secure alliances and prevent later disputes. The notion that a 12-year-old girl could give meaningful consent to a lifelong union, including its intimate aspects, was simply not a consideration. She was a child, often still playing with dolls, suddenly thrust into the roles of wife, household manager, and potential mother. Physical and psychological strain of early pregnancy and childbirth on a still developing body was immense, and the emotional burden of premature adulthood stripped these young women of their childhood entirely. Consequences of forced marriage were far-reaching and often lifelong. A woman might be forced to live with a man she feared, despised, or found repulsive. If her husband was abusive physically, emotionally, or sexually, she had virtually no means of escape. Divorce was exceedingly rare and difficult to obtain, usually requiring a complex process through church courts and only granted for very specific reasons, such as consanguinity or impotence, rarely for abuse. Annulment, which declared a marriage had never been valid, was even harder to secure and often came with social stigma. The woman was trapped, bound by legal and religious ties that offered no sanctuary from her tormentor. The lack of agency in such a fundamental life decision led to deep-seated resentment, unhappiness, and a profound sense of powerlessness. Women in forced marriages often endured lives devoid of affection, companionship, or respect. They were expected to produce heirs, manage households, and work tirelessly, all while suppressing their own desires and emotions. Historical records, such as papal letters or court petitions, occasionally hint at women attempting to resist forced marriages, often by fleeing to convents or seeking annulments on technical grounds. These instances, however rare, speak volumes about the desperation felt by those trapped in unions not of their choosing. Forced marriage was not merely a social convention. It was a form of systemic abuse that denied women their basic human rights, often condemning them to lives of misery, servitude, and vulnerability. It was a mechanism of control, ensuring that women's bodies, their labor, and their potential to bear children served the interests of male-dominated society, rather than their own well-being. The wedding vows, meant to symbolize union, often became the shackles of a woman's lifelong imprisonment, a poignant example of how deeply entrenched forms of abuse were normalized within the very fabric of medieval society. Number 1. Physical violence within marriage and households. In the year 1165, the grim reality for countless women was that physical violence, particularly within their own homes and at the hands of those closest to them, was not only common, but was often sanctioned by law, custom, and even religious teachings. The concept of a man having the right to chastise his wife, daughter, or female servant was deeply ingrained in medieval society, making physical abuse a pervasive and tragically normalized form of control and punishment. There was no public outcry, no victim support, and very little legal recourse for women who suffered such brutality. A wife was legally considered her husband's property, a dependent akin to a child or a servant. This legal status gave husbands immense power, including the right to inflict corporal punishment to ensure obedience and order within the household. While there were some vague limitations, extreme violence leading to death or permanent maiming might, in theory, be punishable by local courts. The vast majority of beatings, slaps, and shoves went unrecorded and unchallenged. Imagine a woman, perhaps late at night in her own home, suffering a beating from her husband for a perceived transgression, a meal not cooked to his liking, a word spoken out of turn, or simply his drunken rage. She would have nowhere to run, no one to call for help, and no expectation that anyone would intervene. Her screams would likely be ignored by neighbors, who saw it as a private matter, or by servants, who feared the master's wrath. These beatings were often severe and recurrent. It could leave women with broken bones, internal injuries, disfigurement, and chronic pain. Constant fear of violence would have been a pervasive presence in their daily lives, forcing them to walk on eggshells, to anticipate moods, and to suppress their own personalities to avoid provoking an attack. A wife might endure a beating for failing to produce a male heir, for speaking with another man, or for simply being in the way. Her value was often tied to her usefulness and obedience, and any perceived deviation could be met with swift, brutal physical force designed to reassert dominance and control. Daughters were also subject to similar forms of physical punishment from their fathers or male guardians. Discipline of children, especially girls, often involved harsh beatings to ensure their obedience and conformity to societal expectations. A young girl struggling with household chores or expressing a defiant streak could be subjected to severe corporal punishment that left her bruised and terrified. This instilled a deep-seated fear of male authority from a very young age, shaping their future interactions and reinforcing their subservient role. Female servants were particularly vulnerable to physical abuse from their masters and mistresses. Virtually no rights and often entirely dependent on their employers for their livelihood, servant girls could be beaten for minor infractions, for clumsiness, or simply as an outlet for a master's frustration. Their low social status meant their complaints would carry no weight, and they faced the constant threat of dismissal, leaving them destitute, or worse, further violence if they dared to protest. Medieval court records, though sparse, occasionally hint at such abuses when they escalated to extreme levels, but the everyday slaps and blows would rarely, if ever, see the light of judicial scrutiny. The Church, while theoretically condemning excessive violence, often upheld the husband's right to correct his wife, citing biblical passages that emphasized female submission. Preachers might advise wives to endure their suffering patiently, viewing it as a test of their piety or as a way to earn salvation. This religious sanction further cemented the idea that physical abuse was not a sin or a crime, but a legitimate exercise of authority within the patriarchal order. Legal codes such as those found in early English common law often allowed for a husband's moderate correction of his wife, failing to define what moderate truly meant and rarely intervening unless the abuse resulted in grievous harm or death. The physical and psychological toll of living under such a constant threat of violence was immense. Women suffered from chronic injuries, disabilities, and a pervasive sense of fear. The emotional scars were equally profound, leading to deep trauma, anxiety, and learned helplessness. Many women internalized the belief that they deserved the violence, or that it was simply an unavoidable part of a woman's lot in life. No safe houses, no police to call, and no sympathetic ear in the legal system, a woman trapped in an abusive household in 1165 was often left to endure her torment in terrifying isolation, her body and spirit battered by the silent, accepted brutality of her everyday existence. It was a dark testament to a world where physical power defined rights, and where women were, all too often, simply at the mercy of those who held it.